Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart or just a few time zones away? Both listening as the stars come out. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. But before we dive into these nightmare rulers, let me give you some context about just how violent the Viking Age really was. Most people think they understand Viking brutality from movies and TV shows, but the reality was far worse than anything Hollywood has ever dared to portray. We're talking about an era where skinning people alive was considered a legitimate form of justice, where burning enemies inside their own homes was standard military practice, and where the most creative forms of torture were seen as displays of artistic genius. Here's what makes this video different from every other Viking documentary you've watched. I've spent months digging through medieval chronicles, archaeological evidence, and historical accounts that most creators completely ignore. These aren't just stories. These are documented cases of human monsters who happen to wear crowns and carry axes. By the end of this series, you'll understand why the mere mention of certain Viking names could empty entire villages, and why some of these rulers were so feared that people would rather die than face them in battle. Now, what you need to understand about Viking society is that violence wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. But even by Viking standards, the rulers we're about to discuss crossed lines that made their own people uncomfortable. These were individuals who took the already brutal Viking culture and pushed it to its absolute breaking point. Let me start with a question that will set the tone for everything we're about to explore. What would you do if you knew that tomorrow a Viking king was sailing toward your village with a reputation so terrifying that mothers would kill their own children rather than let them fall into his hands? That's not an exaggeration. That's historical fact. There are documented cases of parents choosing murder over allowing their families to face certain Viking rulers. The first thing you need to know about these terrible kings is that their cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated, strategic, and designed to create maximum psychological impact. They understood that fear was the most powerful weapon they could wield, more effective than any sword or battle axe. A single act of unimaginable brutality could terrorize entire regions into submission without a single battle being fought. Take the concept of the blood eagle, for example. This wasn't just execution, it was performance art designed to send a message that would echo across generations. The victim would be kept alive while their ribs were cut away from their spine and their lungs pulled out to create the appearance of wings. The fact that this torture method has a poetic name tells you everything you need to know about how Vikings viewed extreme violence. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The kings and warlords we're about to discuss didn't just participate in these rituals. They invented new ones. They competed with each other to create the most horrific deaths, the most creative tortures, and the most psychologically devastating campaigns of terror. It was like a twisted game where the prize was absolute power, and the cost was any semblance of humanity. What makes these rulers even more terrifying is that they weren't mindless brutes. Many of them were brilliant strategists, charismatic leaders, and skilled politicians. They understood exactly what they were doing and chose to embrace evil as a tool of statecraft. They could switch from charming diplomat to sadistic torturer in the span of a single conversation. The archaeological evidence supports just how extreme their violence really was. We've found mass graves where victims were clearly tortured before death, burial sites where people were buried alive with their rulers, and evidence of ritualistic cannibalism practiced by Viking elites. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic practices that defined entire reigns. Now, I want you to imagine living in a world where the person with absolute power over your life viewed human suffering as entertainment. Where your king might decide to have you flayed alive simply because he was bored. Or where your children might be taken as sacrifices to appease gods who demanded increasingly creative forms of death. This was reality for millions of people living under Viking rule. The first ruler we need to discuss earned his place in history not just through conquest, but through the sheer creativity of his cruelty. This was a king who understood that reputation could be more powerful than any army, and he built his reputation on acts so horrific that chroniclers of the time struggled to find words to describe them. But before we get to the specific stories, you need to understand the context that created these monsters. The Viking Age was a period of constant warfare, resource scarcity, and social upheaval. In this environment, only the most ruthless could survive, and only the most terrifying could rule. Natural selection favored psychopaths, and the political system rewarded those who could inflict the most fear. The religious beliefs of the time also played a crucial role. The Norse gods themselves were violent, capricious beings who demanded blood sacrifice and rewarded brutality. When your religion teaches that the gods favor those who die gloriously in battle and that Valhalla is reserved for the most violent warriors, it creates a culture where extreme violence becomes not just acceptable but sacred. What's particularly chilling is how these rulers justified their actions. They didn't see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as chosen by the gods to bring order through terror. They believed that their cruelty was a divine mandate, that their victims deserved their fate, and that mercy was actually a form of weakness that would anger the gods. The economic factors can't be ignored either. Viking society was built on raiding, slavery, and tribute. The most successful rulers were those who could extract the most wealth through violence and intimidation. This created a feedback loop where increasing brutality led to greater success, which encouraged even more extreme behavior. Consider the impact this had on neighboring civilizations. Entire kingdoms would pay massive tributes just to avoid being targeted by the most notorious Viking rulers. The mere threat of their arrival could destabilize entire regions, cause mass migrations, and reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The first king we're going to examine in detail understood all of these dynamics and exploited them to build an empire of terror that lasted for decades. His name alone could stop armies in their tracks and cause seasoned warriors to flee in panic. But what made him truly terrifying wasn't just his personal capacity for violence, it was his ability to inspire that same level of brutality in his followers. This ruler didn't just kill his enemies, he made examples of them that would be remembered for generations. He didn't just conquer territories, he traumatized entire populations so thoroughly that they would never again consider rebellion. He didn't just win battles, he created legends of horror that mothers would use to frighten children centuries after his death. The methods he used were so extreme that even other Viking kings considered him excessive. In a culture that celebrated violence, he managed to stand out as uniquely cruel. His innovations in torture and execution became the standard by which other rulers measured their own brutality. What's most disturbing is how methodical he was about it all. This wasn't mindless rage or battlefield frenzy. This was calculated psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit. He studied his victims, understood their fears, and crafted punishments specifically designed to maximize their suffering while sending the clearest possible message to anyone who might oppose him. The chroniclers of his time struggled to document his reign because the acts he committed seemed too extreme to be believed. Modern historians have had to piece together his story from fragments and references because many of the original accounts were considered too disturbing to preserve. Yet the evidence that remains paints a picture of a ruler who redefined what it meant to be truly evil. This king's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. His methods were copied by other rulers. His reputation became a template for how to rule through fear, and his legacy shaped Viking culture for generations. He proved that in the medieval world, being feared was far more valuable than being loved, and that there was no limit to how far a ruler could go in pursuit of absolute power. His name was Ivar the Boneless, and the very mention of it could empty entire monasteries and send armies fleeing before they even saw his ships on the horizon. But here's what most people don't understand about Ivar. The nickname Boneless didn't refer to some physical disability like many historians claim. It referred to his complete lack of human compassion, his ability to bend and twist like a serpent, striking where his enemies least expected it. What made Ivar truly terrifying wasn't just his tactical genius or his massive army. It was his understanding that the human mind could be broken far more effectively than the human body. While other Viking kings focused on quick conquests and immediate plunder, Ivar played a longer game. He was building something far more sinister than an empire. He was creating a legacy of pure terror that would outlast any kingdom. The first documented case of Ivar's unique brand of cruelty happened during his conquest of York in 866. After capturing the city, he didn't just execute the defending nobles like any normal Viking would. Instead, he gathered the entire population in the city centre and announced that he would demonstrate what happened to those who opposed him. What followed was 3 days of public torture that was so systematic and creative that witnesses described it as watching a master craftsman at work. But here's where Ivar's genius for psychological warfare really showed itself. He didn't kill everyone. He deliberately left survivors, people who had witnessed the full extent of his capabilities. And then he sent them to neighbouring cities with a simple message: submit immediately or face something far worse than what York had endured. This wasn't just conquest. It was psychological terrorism on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. The chronicles describe how entire armies would surrender without fighting after hearing detailed accounts of what Ivar had done to previous opponents. Seasoned warriors, men who had faced death countless times, would throw down their weapons and beg for mercy rather than risk experiencing his creative approach to punishment. He had weaponized fear itself, turning it into his most effective military tool. What's particularly chilling about Ivar's methods is how he personalized each act of cruelty. He would study his victims, learn about their families, their fears, their beliefs, and then craft punishments that were specifically designed to break them psychologically before they died physically. He understood that true power came not from killing your enemies, but from making them wish they had never been born. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which rarely went into detail about Viking atrocities, made an exception for Ivar. The monks who wrote it described his actions as being so far beyond normal human cruelty that they questioned whether he was actually human at all. They called him the serpent without bones and suggested that he might be a demon given physical form to punish the sins of mankind. But Ivar's masterpiece of terror was yet to come. In 867, he captured King Ella of Northumbria, the man who had allegedly killed his father Ragnar Lothbrok. Now any Viking son would be expected to avenge his father's death, but Ivar transformed this personal vendetta into a public spectacle that would define his legacy forever. The execution of King Aella became known as the most elaborate blood eagle ever performed. But Ivar didn't just follow the traditional ritual. He spent weeks preparing, gathering an audience of nobles, warriors, and common people from across England. He wanted everyone to see what happened when someone crossed the sons of Ragnar. He wanted to create a memory so traumatic that it would be passed down through generations. The ritual itself took place over the course of an entire day. Ivar had constructed a special platform where everyone could see clearly. He provided commentary throughout the process, explaining each step, describing what the victim was feeling, and making jokes that only seemed to amuse him. Witnesses described his demeanor as almost cheerful, like a teacher explaining a particularly interesting lesson to his students. What made this even more disturbing was how Ivar incorporated elements of Norse religious ritual into the torture. He wasn't just killing an enemy, he was making a sacrifice to Odin, ensuring that his victims' suffering would please the gods and bring divine favor to his future campaigns. This religious framework allowed him to justify any level of cruelty as holy work. The psychological impact of King Eilar's execution rippled across medieval Europe. Word spread not just of what Ivar had done, but of how he had done it. The calm, methodical way he approached torture. The joy he seemed to take in his victims' suffering. The religious fervor with which he embraced extreme violence. Other rulers began to understand that they were dealing with something unprecedented. But Ivar wasn't finished. Having established his reputation through this single act, he began to expand his methods. He developed what can only be described as a science of suffering, experimenting with different techniques, studying which methods produced the most fear in observers, and refining his approach based on the results he achieved. His next innovation was the concept of graduated punishment. Rather than simply executing rebels or enemies, he would create elaborate scenarios where victims faced increasingly severe consequences based on the level of their resistance. Those who surrendered immediately might face relatively quick deaths. Those who fought briefly would endure longer tortures, but those who dared to defy him to the end would face punishment so severe that chroniclers refused to record the details. This system created a perverse incentive structure where resistance became psychologically impossible. People knew that fighting back would only make their inevitable fate worse, so entire populations began surrendering at the first sign of Ivar's approach. He had essentially broken the human will to resist, turning courage itself into a liability. The most terrifying aspect of Ivar's reign was how he inspired others. His success attracted followers who shared his appetite for extreme violence, and he began training them in his methods. He created what was essentially a school for psychopaths, teaching other Vikings how to use terror as a tool of statecraft. These students then spread across Europe, carrying his techniques to new territories and new victims. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Ivar's campaigns reveals the true scope of his cruelty. Mass graves containing victims who show signs of prolonged torture. Burn layers in settlements that suggest systematic destruction designed to maximize suffering rather than simply eliminate resistance. Evidence of ritualistic practices that combined Norse religious elements with unprecedented levels of violence. What's most disturbing is how Ivar's approach influenced Viking culture as a whole. Other kings began adopting his methods, not because they were naturally as cruel as he was, but because his techniques were so effective. Terror became the standard tool of Viking expansion, and the bar for what constituted acceptable violence was raised to levels that would have shocked earlier generations of Vikings. The long-term consequences of Ivar's innovations in cruelty extended far beyond his own lifetime. His methods became part of Viking military doctrine, passed down through generations of warriors and kings. The psychological techniques he developed for breaking enemy morale became standard practice, and his reputation continued to terrorize populations decades after his death. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Ivar the Boneless was his apparent enjoyment of his work. Unlike other brutal rulers who seemed to view violence as a necessary evil, Ivar genuinely appeared to love what he did. Witnesses consistently described his demeanor during acts of torture as joyful, almost playful. He had found his calling in human suffering, and he pursued it with the dedication of an artist perfecting his craft. However, Ivar was just the beginning of our journey into Viking brutality. As terrifying as he was, there were other rulers who managed to exceed even his standards of cruelty. Kings who looked at what Ivar had accomplished and decided they could do worse. The competition for who could be the most feared Viking ruler created an escalating arms race of terror that pushed human cruelty to its absolute limits. The next ruler we need to examine makes Ivar the Boneless look like a gentle schoolteacher. This was a king who saw Ivar's reputation and decided it wasn't nearly extreme enough. Where Ivar used terror as a tool, this ruler made suffering his religion. Where Ivar broke people's spirits, this king shattered their very souls. His name was Eric Bloodaxe, and the stories surrounding his reign are so horrific that medieval chroniclers often refused to write them down completely. They would start a sentence describing one of his acts, then trail off with phrases like, "What followed cannot be spoken by Christian tongues," or "The details are too foul for holy parchment." When monks who regularly documented Viking atrocities couldn't bring themselves to record what this man did, you know you're dealing with something truly monstrous. But here's what makes Eric even more terrifying than Ivar. Where Ivar was calculating and methodical, Eric was impulsive and creative. He would wake up each morning and decide to invent a new form of torture simply because he was bored. His victims never knew what to expect, because Eric himself didn't know what he was going to do until the moment inspired him. The first documented case of Eric's unique approach to cruelty happened during his consolidation of power in Norway. His father, Harald Fairhair, had multiple sons, and Viking tradition demanded that they fight for succession. Most brothers would kill each other quickly in battle or through poison. Eric decided that was far too merciful. He wanted his brothers to suffer, to regret ever being born, to curse their father for creating them. One by one, Eric captured his brothers and their families, but instead of executing them immediately, he kept them alive for months, subjecting them to daily tortures that became increasingly elaborate. He would force them to watch as he tortured their children, their wives, their most loyal followers. He wanted them to experience every possible form of loss and despair before he finally allowed them to die. The youngest brother, Bjorn, was reportedly kept alive for 6 months. Each day, Eric would remove a different part of his body, but always in a way that wouldn't cause immediate death. Fingers, toes, ears, pieces of skin, small sections of muscle. He documented each removal, creating a sort of calendar of suffering that he would read aloud to other prisoners as a preview of their own fate. But Eric's true innovation was psychological. He understood that physical pain was limited, that the human body could only endure so much before it shut down. Mental anguish, however, had no such limits. The mind could be tortured indefinitely, broken and rebuilt and broken again, in an endless cycle of despair. He developed what can only be described as emotional warfare. He would capture the families of his enemies and then force them to participate in the torture of their own loved ones. Mothers would be given the choice between torturing their children or watching Eric do something far worse to them. Fathers would be forced to decide which of their sons would die first, knowing that their choice would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. The psychological damage Eric inflicted extended far beyond his immediate victims. Entire communities developed what we might now recognize as collective trauma. Children who witnessed his campaigns grew up unable to form normal relationships. Adults who survived his attacks often took their own lives years later, unable to cope with the memories of what they had seen. What made Eric's reign particularly nightmarish was his unpredictability. Other brutal rulers at least had patterns, methods that people could anticipate and maybe prepare for. Eric changed his approach constantly, ensuring that no one could ever feel safe, that no one could ever develop strategies for survival. The only constant was that whatever he did next would be worse than what he had done before. The saga writers, who were never shy about describing violence, struggled to find words for Eric's actions. They developed a whole new vocabulary of suffering, creating terms that had never existed before because no one had ever needed to describe such elaborate cruelty. These words entered the Norse language and spread throughout Scandinavia, becoming permanent reminders of what Eric had unleashed upon the world. His treatment of prisoners became legendary throughout medieval Europe. Unlike other Vikings who kept slaves for labor or ransom, Eric kept people purely for entertainment. He would spend hours each day personally overseeing their torture, not because it served any strategic purpose, but because he genuinely enjoyed watching human beings break apart piece by piece. The most disturbing accounts describe Eric's dinner parties, where he would invite other nobles to feast while prisoners were tortured for their amusement. These weren't quick executions or simple beatings. They were elaborate performances that could last for hours, with Eric providing commentary, making jokes, and encouraging his guests to suggest new torments. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Eric's rule tells a story that's somehow even worse than the written accounts. We've found chambers that were clearly designed specifically for torture, with special drainage systems to handle blood, restraining devices that allowed for prolonged suffering without death, and tools whose only possible purpose was to inflict maximum pain. But perhaps most chilling of all are the mass graves where victims were buried while still alive. The positioning of the skeletons shows clear signs of struggle, scratch marks on the inside of burial containers, and evidence that people were conscious when the dirt was thrown over them. Eric had apparently decided that even death was too merciful for some of his enemies. The religious implications of Eric's cruelty were particularly disturbing to medieval chroniclers. While other Viking rulers justified their violence through Norse religious traditions, Eric seemed to be inventing his own twisted theology. He claimed that the gods demanded increasingly creative forms of sacrifice, that traditional offerings were no longer sufficient to maintain divine favor. He established what can only be described as temples of torture, sacred spaces where the most elaborate forms of suffering were carried out in the name of religious devotion. These sites became pilgrimage destinations for the most violent Vikings, places where they could come to learn new techniques and pay homage to what they saw as the ultimate expression of warrior culture. The impact of Eric's innovations spread far beyond Norway. Other Viking rulers began adopting his methods not out of religious conviction, but because they were terrifyingly effective. Fear of experiencing Eric's style of punishment became so widespread that entire armies would surrender rather than risk capture. He had essentially weaponized human imagination, using people's ability to envision suffering as a tool of conquest. But Eric's influence went deeper than just military tactics. He changed the fundamental nature of Viking society, pushing it toward levels of cruelty that earlier generations would have found incomprehensible. The casual violence that had always been part of Norse culture became systematic, ritualized, and increasingly extreme under his influence. The long-term psychological damage Eric inflicted on Scandinavian society can still be traced in the sagas and folklore that developed after his death. Stories of his reign became cautionary tales that parents would tell children, warnings about what happened when power was given to someone with no moral constraints whatsoever. What makes Eric Bloodaxe truly terrifying from a historical perspective is how he normalized extreme cruelty. By pushing the boundaries of acceptable violence so far beyond anything that had come before, he made lesser forms of brutality seem reasonable by comparison. Future rulers could justify their own cruel acts by pointing out that they weren't as bad as Eric, even when their actions would have been considered monstrous by earlier standards. However, as horrific as Eric Bloodaxe was, he still operated within some recognizable framework of Viking culture and Norse religion. Our next ruler abandoned even these thin pretenses of civilization. He was a king who looked at Eric's innovations and decided they weren't nearly creative enough. A man who made suffering into a form of high art. This was Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and his approach to cruelty was so sophisticated that it bordered on genius. Where Eric was impulsive and emotional in his violence, Sigurd was calculating and precise. He studied human psychology like a scholar, understanding exactly how to break different types of people, how to maximize despair, and how to create suffering that would last far beyond the physical torture itself. Sigurd's innovations began with his understanding that different people feared different things. A warrior might be unafraid of physical pain, but terrified of dishonor. A merchant might care more about his wealth than his life. A parent would do anything to protect their children. Sigurd catalogued these fears, like a naturalist studying different species, developing specialized torture methods for each type of victim. But his true breakthrough was the realization that the anticipation of suffering could be more powerful than the suffering itself. He would capture his enemies and then spend weeks, sometimes months, describing in elaborate detail exactly what he planned to do to them. He would show them the tools he would use, explain the process step by step, and force them to participate in planning their own torture. This psychological approach allowed Sigurd to break people before he ever laid a hand on them. By the time the actual torture began, his victims were already shattered, existing in a state of terror so complete that death became a mercy they would beg for. He had learned to torture the mind so effectively that torturing the body became almost redundant. The chronicles describe Sigurd's court as resembling something from a nightmare. He surrounded himself with people who shared his fascination with human suffering, creating an environment where cruelty was not just accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of art. Courtiers would compete to suggest new forms of torture, and those who impressed Sigurd with their creativity would be rewarded with positions of power. What made Sigurd particularly dangerous was his intelligence. Unlike Eric, who was driven by impulse and emotion, Sigurd approached cruelty with the methodical precision of a craftsman. He kept detailed records of his experiments in torture, noting which methods were most effective against different types of victims, which techniques produced the most fear in observers, and which approaches had the longest-lasting psychological effects. These records, fragments of which survived into the medieval period, reveal a mind that was utterly devoted to perfecting the science of suffering. Sigurd didn't just want to hurt people. He wanted to understand pain in all its forms, to map the boundaries of human endurance, and to push those boundaries further than anyone had ever imagined possible. His most notorious innovation was what he called the long death, a process that could extend a victim's suffering for months or even years. Through careful medical knowledge, he learned how to inflict maximum pain while keeping people alive and conscious. He studied human anatomy not to heal, but to discover new ways to cause agony without causing death. The psychological techniques Sigurd developed were perhaps even more horrific than his physical tortures. He would force victims to make impossible choices, decisions that would haunt them regardless of what they chose. A mother might be told to select which of her children would die first, knowing that her choice would determine not just who died, but how they died. These moral tortures were designed to destroy not just the body, but the soul. Sigurd understood that people could sometimes survive physical trauma, but they rarely recovered from being forced to participate in the destruction of everything they loved. He was creating damage that would last for generations, trauma that would be passed down through families and communities like a hereditary curse. The impact of Sigurd's reign extended far beyond his immediate victims. The techniques he developed became part of Viking military doctrine, spreading throughout Scandinavia and beyond. Other rulers studied his methods, adapted his innovations, and pushed the boundaries of cruelty even further. He had started an arms race in human suffering that would define the later Viking Age. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how Sigurd's approach influenced the fundamental character of Viking society. The casual acceptance of extreme violence that had always been part of Norse culture became something far darker under his influence. Cruelty became not just a tool of war or a means of control, but an end in itself, a form of entertainment and artistic expression. The archaeological evidence from sites associated with Sigurd's rule reveals the true scope of his experiments in suffering. We found elaborate torture chambers with sophisticated drainage systems, restraining devices that allowed for precise control over victims' positions, and tools that could only have been designed by someone with an intimate knowledge of human anatomy and an unlimited imagination for causing pain. Most chilling of all are the remains that show evidence of Sigurd's long death techniques, skeletons that bear the marks of repeated, carefully controlled trauma, bones that show signs of healing and re-breaking, indicating that victims were kept alive through multiple cycles of torture. Evidence of medical intervention designed not to heal, but to prolong suffering. These archaeological findings confirm what the written sources suggest, that Sigurd had essentially turned torture into a medical science, approaching human suffering with the same systematic methodology that other scholars applied to astronomy or mathematics. He was conducting research into the limits of human endurance, and his test subjects were anyone unfortunate enough to fall into his hands. The religious implications of Sigurd's work were particularly disturbing to his contemporaries. While he claimed to be honoring the Norse gods through his elaborate sacrifices, many Vikings began to question whether his actions were actually pleasing to any deity. Some suggested that he had been corrupted by dark forces, that his innovations in cruelty came from sources that were fundamentally anti-divine. This religious controversy added another layer to Sigurd's reign of terror. He wasn't just a political and military threat. He was a spiritual one as well. People began to believe that his very presence could corrupt others, that exposure to his methods could turn normal people into monsters. Communities that had never seen him firsthand lived in fear that his influence might somehow reach them, transforming their neighbors and loved ones into copies of the Snake in the Eye himself. The legacy of Sigurd's Snake in the Eye created a template that would inspire the next generation of Viking monsters, rulers who saw his systematic approach to cruelty and decided they could improve upon it. But our next king didn't just want to match Sigurd's innovations, he wanted to surpass them entirely. This was a ruler who looked at the science of suffering that Sigurd had created and decided it wasn't nearly ambitious enough. His name was Halfdan the Black, and despite what his nickname might suggest, the darkness he brought to the world had nothing to do with his appearance. The blackness referred to the shadow he cast over medieval Europe, a darkness so complete that entire regions would remain traumatized for generations after his death. Where previous rulers had focused on perfecting individual acts of cruelty, Halfdan thought bigger. He wanted to create systematic campaigns of terror that would reshape entire civilizations. What made Halfdan uniquely terrifying was his understanding of scale. Previous Viking kings had tortured hundreds or maybe thousands of people during their reigns. Halfdan was thinking in terms of entire populations. He didn't want to break individual enemies. He wanted to break the human spirit itself, to create such widespread trauma that people would lose the ability to resist Viking rule entirely. His first innovation was the concept of inherited punishment. Halfdan realized that killing someone's enemies was actually quite merciful because it ended their suffering. Instead, he developed techniques for ensuring that the consequences of opposing him would last for generations. He would capture the children of his enemies and raise them in environments specifically designed to turn them into instruments of torture against their own people. These children, taken at young ages, would be subjected to years of conditioning that stripped away their humanity and replaced it with an insatiable appetite for violence. They were taught that cruelty was love, that causing pain was the highest form of devotion, and that their original families had abandoned them to their fate. When they reached adulthood, Halfdan would send them back to their home communities as agents of terror, equipped with all the torture techniques he had developed and motivated by a twisted desire to prove their loyalty to their new master. The psychological impact of this strategy was devastating. Parents lived in constant fear that their own children might one day return as monsters. Communities could never trust young people who had been captured and later escaped or been released, because everyone knew about Halfdan's conditioning programs. He had weaponized the most fundamental human bonds, turning love itself into a source of terror. But Halfdan's true masterpiece was what he called the Festival of Sorrows. Once each year, he would select a different region for what he described as a celebration of human suffering. These weren't quick raids or even extended sieges. They were elaborate, months-long campaigns designed to showcase every torture technique that had been developed by him and his predecessors. The festival would begin with Halfdan's arrival at the selected region, accompanied by a massive entourage of his most skilled torturers, his conditioned child soldiers, and representatives from every territory under his control. The local population would be gathered in central locations where they could all witness what was about to unfold. Then, for the next several months, Halfdan would systematically work through the entire population, demonstrating different forms of torture on different groups of people. What made these festivals particularly horrific was their educational component. Halfdan didn't just want to terrorize the local population, he wanted to teach other rulers how to implement his techniques in their own territories. Representatives from across the Viking world would attend these events like students at a university, taking notes on new methods, asking questions about implementation, and competing to suggest improvements to the existing techniques. The chroniclers who documented these festivals struggled to find language adequate to describe what they witnessed. Many simply refused to write about them at all, leaving blank pages in their manuscripts with notes like, "Here occurred events too foul for Christian words," or "The devil's work requires no record." The few accounts that survive are so disturbing that modern historians often question whether they can possibly be accurate. Archaeological evidence, however, confirms that something unprecedented was happening during Halfdan's reign. We've found sites that can only be described as torture amphitheatres, massive constructed spaces designed to hold thousands of spectators, while elaborate tortures were carried out in central areas. The engineering required for these facilities suggests that Halfdan was investing enormous resources into perfecting the presentation of human suffering. The remains found at these sites tell a story that's somehow even worse than the written accounts. We've discovered evidence of torture techniques that required multiple people working in coordination, suggesting that Halfdan had developed team-based approaches to inflicting pain. There are signs of medical intervention designed to keep victims alive through procedures that should have been fatal, indicating that he had recruited healers to serve as torture consultants. Most disturbing of all are the mass graves containing what appear to be entire family groups, arranged in positions that suggest they were forced to torture each other before being killed. The positioning of the remains indicates that these weren't random acts of violence, but carefully choreographed scenes designed to maximize psychological impact on both participants and observers. The long-term effects of Halfdan's festivals of sorrows rippled across medieval Europe for centuries. Entire regions developed cultural practices designed to appease Viking rulers, hoping that submission and tribute might protect them from being selected for future festivals. The mere rumor that Halfdan was considering a particular area for his next celebration was enough to cause mass migrations and economic collapse. But perhaps most chilling was how these festivals influenced other Viking rulers. What had started as Halfdan's personal innovation became an expected part of Viking kingship. Future rulers felt pressure to organize their own festivals, to demonstrate that they were worthy successors to Halfdan's legacy. The competition to create the most elaborate displays of cruelty became a defining characteristic of late Viking Age politics. The religious implications of the festivals were particularly complex. While Halfdan claimed they were massive sacrificial offerings to the Norse gods, many Vikings began to question whether any deity would actually desire such elaborate suffering. Some suggested that the festivals had moved beyond religious ritual into something that was purely demonic, that Halfdan had opened doorways to forces that no human should ever contact. This spiritual controversy created divisions within Viking society that would last for generations. Traditional Vikings, who valued courage and strength in battle, began to distance themselves from the torture-focused culture that Halfdan was creating. They argued that true warriors should face their enemies in honest combat, not spend months devising elaborate methods of causing pain to helpless victims. But Halfdan's influence was too strong to resist. The effectiveness of his terror campaigns meant that rulers who refused to adopt his methods found themselves at a severe disadvantage. Traditional Viking warfare, based on raids and battles, couldn't compete with the psychological impact of systematic torture programs. Communities would surrender to avoid the possibility of being selected for a festival, making military conquest almost redundant. The economic implications were equally significant. Halfdan's approach required enormous resources to implement properly. The construction of torture facilities, the training of specialized personnel, the maintenance of conditioning programs for captured children, all of this required a level of organization and investment that transformed Viking society from loose confederations of warriors into centralized terror states. This transformation had consequences that extended far beyond the Viking world. The resources required for Halfdan's programs came from increased raiding and tribute collection, which put enormous pressure on neighboring civilizations. The Carolingian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms all found themselves dealing with Vikings, who were no longer content with simple plunder, but demanded the resources necessary to maintain elaborate torture programs. The diplomatic implications were equally complex. How do you negotiate with a ruler whose primary tool of statecraft is systematic torture? Traditional medieval diplomacy was based on concepts of honor, mutual respect, and shared religious values. Halfdan had moved beyond these frameworks entirely, creating a form of international relations based purely on fear and the threat of unimaginable suffering. This diplomatic revolution forced other medieval rulers to reconsider their own approaches to governance. Some tried to match Halfdan's methods, leading to an escalating arms race and cruelty that spread far beyond Scandinavia. Others attempted to create alliances specifically designed to contain the threat he represented, leading to new forms of international cooperation based on mutual terror rather than mutual interest. The cultural impact of Halfdan's reign was perhaps most significant of all. He had essentially redefined what it meant to be powerful in the medieval world. Previous rulers had been judged by their success in battle, their ability to protect their people, or their skill at accumulating wealth. Halfdan established a new standard based purely on the ability to inflict suffering, to create fear so complete that resistance became psychologically impossible. This cultural shift had profound implications for how medieval people understood authority, justice, and human nature itself. If the most successful rulers were those who could cause the most pain, what did that say about the nature of power? If entire populations could be controlled through terror, what was the value of courage or moral conviction? Halfdan had forced medieval society to confront questions about human nature that it was not prepared to answer. The artistic and literary legacy of his reign was equally disturbing. The festivals of sorrows inspired a whole new genre of artistic expression, works that celebrated cruelty as a form of beauty, torture as a form of poetry. These cultural products spread throughout medieval Europe, normalizing extreme violence and making it seem not just acceptable, but aesthetically pleasing. Halfdan's influence on the development of medieval law was particularly significant. Traditional legal systems were based on concepts of proportional punishment, where the severity of the penalty matched the severity of the crime. Halfdan's approach made proportionality irrelevant, establishing the principle that any opposition to authority justified unlimited punishment. This legal philosophy would influence European jurisprudence for centuries, contributing to the development of increasingly harsh penalties for political crimes. But perhaps most importantly, Halfdan had proven that systematic cruelty could be not just politically effective, but economically profitable. The resources generated by his terror campaigns, the tribute paid by communities desperate to avoid his attention, the wealth accumulated through his systematic exploitation of fear, all of this demonstrated that extreme violence could be a sustainable economic model. This economic lesson was not lost on future rulers, both Viking and non-Viking. The idea that terror could be monetized, that suffering could be turned into a source of revenue, became a fundamental principle of medieval statecraft. Halfdan had essentially invented the business model that would dominate European politics for the next several centuries. However, even Halfdan's innovations in systematic cruelty were eventually surpassed by rulers who saw his work as merely the foundation for even more elaborate forms of terror. Our next king didn't just want to improve upon Halfdan's methods, he wanted to transcend them entirely, to create forms of suffering so advanced that they would make all previous attempts at cruelty seem primitive by comparison. This was Magnus the Mad, and his approach to torture was so sophisticated that it bordered on the supernatural. Where previous rulers had focused on physical pain or psychological trauma, Magnus understood that true power came from the ability to corrupt the very essence of human nature. He didn't just want to break his enemies, he wanted to transform them into willing participants in their own destruction. Magnus had studied the work of all his predecessors, learning from Ivar's methodical approach, Eric's creative spontaneity, Sigurd's scientific precision, and Halfdan's systematic scale. But he realized that all of these approaches shared a fundamental limitation. They required the torturer to do something to the victim. Magnus wanted to create techniques that would make victims torture themselves, that would turn the human capacity for self-reflection into an instrument of self-destruction. His breakthrough came from his understanding of human psychology at a level that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Magnus realized that people's greatest fears weren't external threats, but internal ones. Everyone carried within themselves the capacity for evil, the potential to become the very monsters they feared most. Magnus developed techniques for awakening this inner darkness, for bringing people face to face with their own capacity for cruelty. The process he developed was deceptively simple. Victims would be placed in situations where they were given choices between different forms of suffering for other people. Initially, the choices would be relatively minor, perhaps deciding whether someone else would be deprived of food or water. But gradually, the stakes would increase. The choices would become more extreme, until victims found themselves making decisions they never imagined they were capable of making. What made this technique so devastating was that it created genuine moral corruption. Unlike physical torture, which left the victim's sense of self intact, Magnus's method actually changed who people were at their core. By the time the process was complete, victims had become willing participants in atrocities, people who had chosen to inflict suffering on others to avoid suffering themselves. This transformation was irreversible in a way that physical torture never was. Bodies could heal, minds could sometimes recover from trauma, but souls that had been corrupted by Magnus's techniques remained corrupted forever. He had learned to damage the fundamental moral structure of human personality, creating changes that would last for the remainder of his victims' lives. The social implications of this technique were catastrophic. Communities that had been subjected to Magnus's methods didn't just recover when he moved on, they remained fractured permanently. People who had been forced to make impossible moral choices couldn't trust themselves or each other. Families were destroyed not by external violence, but by internal shame and guilt that could never be resolved. Magnus understood that this psychological corruption was far more valuable than simple fear. Terrified people might eventually overcome their terror. Traumatized communities might eventually heal. But morally corrupted individuals would continue to spread damage long after Magnus himself had moved on. He was creating a form of spiritual plague that would continue to infect new victims for generations. The religious implications of Magnus's techniques were particularly disturbing to medieval observers. While previous Viking rulers had claimed to be serving the Norse gods through their violence, Magnus seemed to be serving something far darker. His methods weren't just cruel, they were actively evil in a way that suggested supernatural influence. Many chroniclers of the time refused to document Magnus's techniques, not because they were too violent to describe, but because they believed that simply writing about them might spread the corruption to readers. There are manuscripts from this period that have entire sections deliberately destroyed, with notes explaining that the information was too dangerous to preserve. The few accounts that survive suggest that Magnus had moved beyond anything that could be called human cruelty into territory that was genuinely demonic. His techniques didn't just cause suffering, they seemed designed to damn souls, to ensure that his victims would be spiritually destroyed, even if they somehow survived the physical experience. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Magnus's reign is uniquely disturbing because it shows signs of activities that serve no practical purpose whatsoever. Unlike previous rulers who used torture for political or military goals, Magnus seems to have been conducting experiments in corruption for their own sake. The remains suggest elaborate rituals designed not to kill or even to cause pain, but to force people to participate in their own moral destruction. Most chilling of all are sites that appear to have been used for what can only be described as corruption ceremonies, events where multiple victims were forced to make moral choices that would destroy their sense of self. The archaeological evidence suggests that these ceremonies were attended by observers, as if Magnus was teaching others how to implement his techniques for spreading moral corruption. The long-term impact of Magnus's innovations extended far beyond his immediate victims, or even his historical period. The techniques he developed for corrupting human moral judgment became part of the toolkit used by authoritarian rulers throughout history. The understanding that people could be made complicit in their own oppression, that victims could be transformed into perpetrators, became a fundamental principle of political control. But perhaps most significantly, Magnus had proven that the human capacity for moral reasoning could itself be weaponized, that the very qualities that made people human could be turned against them. This insight would influence political philosophy, military strategy, and social control for centuries to come, contributing to some of the darkest chapters in human history. The cultural legacy of Magnus's reign was particularly complex, because his techniques were so effective that they influenced the societies that opposed him as well as those that served him. Communities that successfully resisted his attacks often had to adopt similarly ruthless methods to do so, creating a moral contamination that spread far beyond his direct influence. This moral contamination became one of the defining characteristics of the later Viking Age. The competition between rulers to develop the most effective methods of control led to increasingly sophisticated techniques for corrupting human judgment, for turning people against their own moral instincts, for creating social systems based on complicity rather than simple fear. However, the ultimate expression of Viking cruelty was yet to come. There was one final ruler whose innovations in terror would surpass even Magnus's techniques for moral corruption. This was a king who looked at all the methods developed by his predecessors and realized that they were still thinking too small, that true power required techniques that could corrupt not just individuals or communities, but entire civilizations. His name has been lost to history, deliberately erased from most records because medieval chroniclers believed that preserving it would give him power even after death. They referred to him only as the unnamed king, the corrupter of nations, or simply the final Viking. But the evidence of his reign survives in archaeological sites, in cultural practices that spread across medieval Europe, and in social innovations that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. This final ruler had studied not just the techniques of his Viking predecessors, but the methods used by the most successful tyrants throughout history. He understood that individual cruelty, no matter how extreme, was ultimately limited by the number of people one person could directly affect. True power required the ability to create systems that would continue to generate suffering and corruption long after the original architect was gone. His innovation was the creation of what can only be described as self-perpetuating cycles of moral destruction. Rather than simply corrupting individuals, he developed techniques for corrupting entire social systems, for creating cultures where cruelty became not just accepted but necessary for survival. These weren't temporary changes imposed by force, but permanent transformations that became part of the fundamental structure of society. The evidence suggests that this unnamed king had moved beyond anything that previous rulers had attempted, beyond individual torture or even systematic terror campaigns, into territory that was genuinely unprecedented in human history. He had learned to corrupt the very foundations of civilization itself, creating changes that would continue to generate suffering for centuries after his death. But the full scope of his innovations and their impact on medieval society represents a level of systematic evil so complete that it challenges our understanding of what humans are capable of becoming when power is combined with unlimited cruelty and supernatural intelligence. The techniques developed by this unnamed king represented the culmination of centuries of Viking innovation in systematic cruelty. What made his approach revolutionary was his understanding that traditional torture focused on breaking individuals, while true power required breaking the mechanisms that held societies together. He had learned to weaponize trust itself, turning the social bonds that made civilization possible into instruments of mass destruction. His first breakthrough was the realization that people's greatest vulnerability wasn't their fear of pain, but their need to believe in something greater than themselves. Every society depended on shared myths, common values, and collective beliefs that gave meaning to individual suffering. The unnamed king developed techniques for systematically destroying these foundational beliefs, leaving entire populations in a state of existential despair that made traditional forms of resistance psychologically impossible. The process began with what he called ideological poisoning. Rather than attacking communities directly, he would infiltrate them with agents who had been trained to slowly corrupt their most cherished beliefs. These agents wouldn't openly oppose local customs or religions. Instead, they would ask seemingly innocent questions designed to reveal internal contradictions and moral inconsistencies. Over months or years, these questions would eat away at the foundations of community belief, like acid dissolving stone. People would begin to doubt not just their leaders or their gods, but the very concepts of right and wrong that had previously given their lives meaning. By the time the unnamed king arrived with his armies, he would find populations that had already destroyed themselves from within. What made this technique so devastatingly effective was that the victims participated willingly in their own ideological destruction. They weren't being forced to abandon their beliefs through torture or threats. They were being led to realize that their beliefs had been false all along. This created a form of spiritual despair that was far more complete than anything physical violence could achieve. The chroniclers who attempted to document this process struggled to explain how entire kingdoms could simply lose the will to exist. They described finding cities where the population had grown so despairing that they had stopped maintaining basic infrastructure, stopped having children, stopped engaging in any activities that required hope for the future. These weren't communities that had been conquered, they were civilizations that had committed collective suicide. But the unnamed king's true genius lay in his understanding that this ideological destruction could be made self-perpetuating. Once a society's foundational beliefs had been corrupted, the people themselves would begin spreading that corruption to neighboring communities. Parents would raise children who had never experienced genuine hope. Teachers would educate students in the futility of human effort. And leaders would govern based on the assumption that all human endeavors were ultimately meaningless. This created what can only be described as waves of civilizational collapse that spread far beyond any territory the unnamed king had personally visited. The techniques his agents had used to destroy one community's beliefs would be unconsciously adopted by members of that community, who would then carry them to new locations, like carriers of a spiritual plague. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals something unprecedented in human history. We find layer after layer of abandoned settlements, not destroyed by warfare or natural disasters, but simply left empty as entire populations lost the motivation to continue existing. The artifacts left behind tell stories of communities that had possessed all the resources necessary for survival, but had somehow lost the psychological capacity to use them. Most disturbing are the sites that show evidence of what can only be described as ritualized despair. These weren't religious ceremonies in any traditional sense, but elaborate communal expressions of hopelessness. Events where entire populations would gather to collectively acknowledge the meaninglessness of their existence. The archaeological remains suggest that these rituals became increasingly elaborate over time, as if communities were competing to express their despair in the most comprehensive way possible. The unnamed king had essentially learned to kill civilizations by making them kill themselves. His armies rarely needed to fight battles, because by the time they arrived, there was nothing left to conquer except empty buildings and scattered survivors who welcomed death as relief from the existential agony they had been enduring. What made this approach even more terrifying was its sustainability. Traditional Viking raids required enormous resources and could only target a limited number of communities before the raiders themselves were exhausted. The unnamed king's techniques, once set in motion, required virtually no maintenance while continuing to generate results for decades or even centuries. The religious implications of this systematic destruction of meaning were particularly disturbing to medieval observers. While previous Viking rulers had claimed to serve the Norse gods through their violence, the unnamed king seemed to be serving something that opposed the very concept of divinity itself. His techniques didn't just kill people or destroy communities, they attacked the human capacity to believe in anything transcendent. Many theologians of the time argued that what the unnamed king was doing wasn't just evil in the traditional sense, but represented something fundamentally opposed to the structure of reality itself. They suggested that his techniques were designed not just to cause suffering in this world, but to prevent his victims from accessing any form of spiritual consolation, either in life or after death. This theological controversy had profound implications for how medieval society understood the nature of evil. Previous villains, no matter how cruel, had operated within recognizable frameworks of human motivation. They wanted power, wealth, revenge, or glory. The unnamed king seemed to want something far more disturbing: the complete elimination of human hope and meaning. The cultural impact of his techniques extended far beyond the communities he directly targeted. The mere knowledge that such comprehensive destruction was possible changed how people throughout medieval Europe understood their own existence. If entire civilizations could be made to simply lose the will to continue, what did that say about the stability of human society in general? This existential anxiety became one of the defining characteristics of late medieval culture. Art, literature, and philosophy from this period show an unprecedented preoccupation with themes of meaninglessness and despair. Even communities that had never encountered the unnamed king directly began developing cultural practices designed to protect against the kind of ideological dissolution his techniques produced. The political implications were equally significant. Traditional medieval governance was based on the assumption that people had shared values and beliefs that made social cooperation possible. The unnamed king had proven that these foundations could be systematically destroyed, making conventional forms of political authority obsolete. This led to the development of new forms of governance based not on shared beliefs, but on the management of despair. Rulers began to understand that their primary function wasn't to inspire their subjects toward common goals, but to prevent them from sinking into the kind of existential hopelessness that the unnamed king's techniques produced. The economic implications were equally revolutionary. Traditional medieval economies were based on the assumption that people would work toward future goals, save resources for later use, and invest in projects that might benefit their children or grandchildren. The unnamed king's techniques destroyed the psychological foundations that made these economic behaviors possible. Communities that had been subjected to his ideological attacks often experienced complete economic collapse, not because they lacked resources, but because they had lost the capacity to believe that future planning made sense. Why plant crops if existence itself was meaningless? Why build houses if there was no point in continuing to live? Why have children if life was nothing but suffering without purpose? This economic destruction was often more devastating than anything traditional warfare could achieve. Viking raids might steal wealth or destroy infrastructure, but communities could rebuild as long as they retained the psychological capacity to hope for a better future. The unnamed king's techniques destroyed the mental foundations that made economic recovery possible. The social implications were perhaps most disturbing of all. Human societies depend on countless small acts of cooperation, trust, and mutual support that are only possible when people believe their actions matter. The unnamed king's techniques systematically destroyed these beliefs, making social cooperation psychologically impossible. Communities that had been ideologically poisoned often experienced complete social breakdown as people lost the capacity to form meaningful relationships with each other. If existence itself was meaningless, why help your neighbors? Why care for your children? Why maintain friendships or romantic partnerships? The social fabric that held communities together simply dissolved when people stopped believing that human connections had any value. This social dissolution created feedback loops that made the unnamed king's techniques even more effective. As communities broke apart, individual members experienced increased isolation and despair, which made them even more susceptible to ideological corruption. The process became self-reinforcing, creating spirals of social destruction that could continue for generations. The educational implications were particularly long-lasting. Traditional medieval education was based on the transmission of cultural knowledge, moral values, and practical skills from older generations to younger ones. The unnamed king's techniques made this transmission impossible by destroying the belief that knowledge, morality, or skills had any value worth preserving. Children raised in communities that had been ideologically poisoned often grew up without access to the cultural foundations that previous generations had taken for granted. They learned to read and write, but not why literacy mattered. They were taught practical skills, but not why those skills were worth developing. They were exposed to moral teachings, but not why morality made any difference. This educational destruction created generational gaps that were far more severe than anything caused by traditional warfare. Parents who had experienced meaningful life before the ideological attacks often found themselves unable to communicate with children who had never learned to value anything. The normal process of cultural transmission simply stopped working when the underlying belief in meaning itself had been destroyed. The military implications of the unnamed king's innovations were equally significant. Traditional medieval warfare was based on the assumption that soldiers would fight to protect something they valued, their families, their communities, their beliefs, or their honor. The unnamed king's techniques systematically destroyed all of these motivations, making conventional military resistance impossible. Armies raised from ideologically poisoned populations often simply dissolved when faced with actual combat. Why risk death to protect communities that had no value? Why fight for leaders who represented nothing meaningful? Why endure the hardships of military service when victory and defeat were equally pointless? This military collapse often occurred without any actual fighting. The unnamed king's agents would spend months or years preparing target populations, and by the time his armies arrived, there would be no organized resistance to overcome. His forces could simply walk into abandoned fortifications and empty cities, claiming territory without needing to conquer it. The technological implications were perhaps most subtle, but equally important. Human technological development depends on the belief that improving living conditions is worthwhile, that future generations deserve better tools and techniques than previous ones possessed. The unnamed king's ideological attacks destroyed these beliefs, causing technological development to stagnate or even reverse. Communities that had been subjected to his techniques often abandoned complex technologies, not because they lacked the knowledge to maintain them, but because they had lost the motivation to do so. Why maintain complicated irrigation systems if farming was pointless? Why preserve advanced metalworking techniques if superior weapons served no meaningful purpose? Why continue developing new architectural methods if buildings were just temporary shelters for meaningless lives? This technological regression created additional feedback loops that made recovery even more difficult. As communities lost access to advanced tools and techniques, their material living conditions deteriorated, which increased their despair and made them even more susceptible to ideological corruption. The process became self-reinforcing, creating spirals of technological and cultural decline that could last for centuries. The linguistic implications were particularly fascinating to medieval scholars who attempted to study the unnamed king's techniques. Language itself depends on the belief that communication is meaningful, that sharing ideas and emotions with other people serves some valuable purpose. His ideological attacks often resulted in linguistic degradation, as people lost the motivation to maintain complex forms of expression. Communities that had been ideologically poisoned often experienced rapid simplification of their languages as people stopped caring about precise communication, poetic expression, or the preservation of complex cultural concepts. Vocabularies shrank, grammatical structures simplified, and entire categories of ideas simply disappeared from common usage because no one saw any point in discussing them. This linguistic degradation created additional barriers to recovery because it made it difficult for affected communities to access the cultural knowledge that might have helped them rebuild their sense of meaning. Complex philosophical, religious, and ethical concepts became literally unspeakable as the words needed to express them disappeared from common usage. The artistic implications were equally profound. Human artistic expression depends on the belief that beauty, creativity, and emotional communication have value that transcends immediate practical needs. The unnamed king's techniques systematically destroyed these beliefs, causing artistic traditions to wither and die. Communities that had been ideologically attacked often experienced complete cessation of artistic production as people lost the capacity to see any point in creating beautiful objects, telling stories, composing music, or engaging in any form of creative expression. Existing artworks were often abandoned or destroyed, not out of anger or religious conviction, but simply because no one could remember why they had ever seemed important. This artistic destruction was particularly devastating because art had traditionally served as one of the primary ways that communities preserved and transmitted their most important cultural values. When artistic expression stopped, communities lost access to the cultural resources that might have helped them maintain their sense of identity and purpose during difficult periods. The unnamed king had essentially learned to attack the foundations of human civilization itself, targeting not just individuals or communities, but the basic psychological and cultural mechanisms that made organized human society possible. His techniques represented the ultimate evolution of Viking approaches to power, moving beyond physical violence into territory that was genuinely unprecedented in human history. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that his innovations had continued to spread and evolve long after his own death. The techniques he had developed for destroying meaning and hope had become part of the toolkit used by subsequent rulers throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The understanding that human societies could be controlled by attacking their foundational beliefs rather than their physical infrastructure became a permanent part of political knowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests that variations of the unnamed king's techniques were still being used centuries after the end of the Viking Age. Sites from later medieval periods show the same patterns of ideological destruction, the same evidence of communities that had lost the will to continue existing, the same signs of systematic attacks on the psychological foundations of human society. The long-term historical impact of these innovations extended far beyond the medieval period. The understanding that human meaning and purpose could be systematically destroyed, that entire civilizations could be made to commit psychological suicide, became part of the dark knowledge that authoritarian rulers would continue to exploit throughout history. Modern historians studying the unnamed king's reign often struggle with the implications of what they discover. The techniques he developed were so effective, so comprehensive in their destruction of human hope and meaning, that they challenge our fundamental assumptions about the resilience of human civilization. If entire societies could be made to simply lose the will to exist, what does that say about the stability of our own cultural foundations? The evidence suggests that the innovations developed during the final phase of the Viking Age represented something qualitatively different from previous forms of human cruelty. While earlier tyrants had focused on controlling people through fear or physical force, these final Viking rulers had learned to attack the very foundations of human psychology, to weaponize despair itself as a tool of conquest and control. The legacy of their innovations can be traced through subsequent centuries of European history, influencing the development of increasingly sophisticated techniques for psychological manipulation and social control. The understanding that human societies could be destroyed from within by attacking their foundational beliefs rather than their physical infrastructure became one of the darkest chapters in the evolution of political power. But even this ultimate expression of Viking cruelty was not the end of the story. The techniques developed by these final rulers created precedents and established principles that would continue to influence human civilization long after the Viking Age itself had ended. They had proven that there were no limits to how completely human societies could be destroyed, no boundaries to how thoroughly the human spirit could be broken. The question that remained was whether the innovations they had created would continue to spread and evolve, whether future rulers would find ways to push the boundaries of systematic cruelty even further than these Viking pioneers had managed. The evidence suggests that the answer to that question would shape the next several centuries of human history, as rulers throughout medieval Europe began to experiment with the techniques these final Vikings had bequeathed to posterity. The transformation of Viking culture from a society of warriors and raiders into a civilization of systematic psychological destroyers represented one of the most significant developments in medieval European history. It marked the evolution of human cruelty from a tool of immediate conquest into a science of permanent social control, from a means of winning battles into a method of destroying entire civilizations. The rulers we have examined represent the culmination of this evolution. Kings and warlords who pushed the boundaries of human evil so far beyond anything previously imagined that they created entirely new categories of tyranny. Their innovations in systematic cruelty, psychological manipulation, and social destruction established precedents that would influence the development of authoritarian power for centuries to come. But understanding these historical monsters is crucial not just for comprehending the medieval past, but for recognizing the patterns they established that continue to influence human societies today. The techniques they developed for destroying meaning, corrupting moral judgment, and breaking the psychological foundations of civilization remain part of the toolkit available to those who seek absolute power over other human beings. The influence of these Viking innovations spread like a contagion through medieval Europe, but their most terrifying aspect wasn't just how they changed warfare or politics. It was how they fundamentally altered what it meant to be human in positions of power. The techniques developed by these final Viking rulers created a new breed of leader entirely. Individuals who saw human suffering not as an unfortunate necessity of governance, but as the primary tool through which true authority could be exercised. What made this transformation particularly insidious was how it normalized the previously unthinkable. Before the era of these systematic destroyers, even the most brutal medieval rulers operated within certain understood limits. There were lines that weren't crossed, boundaries that even tyrants respected, codes of conduct that provided some minimal protection for the innocent. The Viking innovators we've examined systematically demolished every single one of these constraints. They proved that there were no natural limits to human cruelty, no inherent boundaries that would prevent rulers from pushing their subjects beyond any conceivable breaking point. More importantly, they demonstrated that crossing these boundaries wasn't just possible, it was profitable. Communities that experienced their innovations didn't just submit, they became incapable of ever mounting resistance again. This lesson wasn't lost on the ambitious rulers who came after them. Throughout the late medieval period, we see the emergence of what can only be described as schools of systematic cruelty, institutions where future leaders studied the techniques pioneered by these Viking masters. The knowledge they had developed became a form of dark curriculum, passed down through generations of increasingly sophisticated tyrants. The most disturbing aspect of this educational process was how it transformed the students who underwent it. Young nobles who entered these programs as relatively normal medieval aristocrats emerged as something fundamentally different. They had been taught not just how to use cruelty as a tool, but how to think like the Viking pioneers, how to see human suffering as an art form to be perfected rather than a necessary evil to be minimized. Archaeological evidence from training facilities used by later medieval rulers shows clear influence from Viking innovations. We find practice chambers designed according to principles developed by the unnamed king, torture devices that incorporate improvements suggested by Magnus the Mad, and educational materials that quote directly from the systematic approaches pioneered by Halfdan the Black. But perhaps most chilling is the evidence that these later rulers weren't content to simply copy Viking techniques. They were actively working to improve upon them, to push the boundaries of systematic cruelty even further than their predecessors had managed. The competition to create new forms of suffering became a driving force in medieval political development. The economic implications of this evolution were staggering. The Viking pioneers had proven that systematic terror could be incredibly profitable, generating resources through tribute, slave labor, and the complete elimination of resistance. Later rulers refined these economic models, creating what were essentially terror-based economies, where human suffering became the primary source of state revenue. These economic systems required constant expansion to remain viable. Once a population had been completely broken through systematic terror, it could no longer generate the resources needed to maintain the apparatus of oppression. This created pressure for rulers to constantly seek new victims, new communities to subject to their refined techniques of destruction. The result was a form of imperial expansion, unlike anything the world had seen before. Traditional empires conquered territory to access resources or strategic advantages. These terror-based states expanded purely to feed their need for fresh victims, creating cycles of conquest and destruction that consumed entire regions of medieval Europe. The social implications were equally profound. The Viking innovations had proven that human social bonds could be systematically destroyed, that communities could be made to turn against themselves through carefully applied psychological pressure. Later, rulers refined these techniques, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for breaking down the trust and cooperation that made organized resistance possible. What emerged was a form of social engineering that targeted the fundamental structures of human community. Families were turned against each other through carefully designed incentive systems. Religious communities were corrupted from within by agents who understood exactly how to exploit theological disagreements. Political alliances were destroyed through the systematic manipulation of fear and suspicion. The long-term effects of these social engineering techniques were devastating. Regions that had been subjected to them often remained fractured for generations, unable to develop the trust and cooperation necessary for effective governance or economic development. The social fabric that had held medieval communities together was systematically shredded. leaving behind populations that were psychologically incapable of organizing effective resistance to future oppression. The religious implications were particularly complex. The Viking pioneers had initially claimed to be serving their gods through their innovations in cruelty. Later rulers, many of them nominally Christian, faced the challenge of justifying similar techniques within different theological frameworks. The solution they developed was the creation of new religious interpretations that portrayed systematic cruelty as a form of divine service. They argued that breaking human spirits was actually a form of spiritual purification, that destroying communities was necessary to eliminate sin, that the suffering they inflicted was ultimately beneficial to their victims' souls. These theological innovations had profound implications for medieval Christianity. Entire branches of religious thought developed around the idea that inflicting suffering was a form of holy work, that the techniques pioneered by Viking rulers were actually expressions of divine will. The boundary between religious devotion and systematic cruelty became increasingly blurred. The intellectual implications were equally disturbing. The Viking innovations had required unprecedented levels of psychological sophistication, deep understanding of human nature, and systematic approaches to breaking mental resistance. Later rulers built upon this intellectual foundation, creating what were essentially universities of applied cruelty. These institutions produced scholars who specialized in the systematic study of human suffering, intellectuals who approached torture and terror with the same methodical precision that other academics applied to mathematics or theology. They developed detailed taxonomies of fear, comprehensive theories of psychological breakdown, and sophisticated models for predicting how different types of people would respond to various forms of pressure. The knowledge produced by these scholarly efforts became increasingly refined over time. What had started as intuitive understanding of human psychology evolved into rigorous scientific approaches to breaking human resistance. The techniques available to later medieval rulers were far more sophisticated than anything the original Viking pioneers could have imagined. The artistic implications were particularly disturbing. The Viking innovations had inspired new forms of cultural expression that celebrated cruelty as a form of beauty. Later rulers refined these artistic traditions, creating elaborate aesthetic frameworks around the systematic infliction of suffering. What emerged was a form of art that was genuinely unprecedented in human history. These weren't simple celebrations of violence or power, but sophisticated aesthetic theories that portrayed human suffering as the highest form of artistic expression. The systematic destruction of communities became a form of performance art, with rulers competing to create the most aesthetically pleasing displays of terror. The cultural products that emerged from this artistic tradition had profound influence on medieval European culture as a whole. Even communities that had never directly experienced these rulers' techniques were exposed to cultural works that normalized extreme cruelty, that portrayed systematic terror as beautiful and sophisticated, rather than horrifying and barbaric. The technological implications were equally significant. The Viking innovations had required the development of new tools and techniques for inflicting suffering, new architectural approaches for constructing facilities designed to maximize psychological impact, new administrative systems for managing large-scale terror campaigns. Later rulers refined these technological approaches, creating increasingly sophisticated infrastructure for systematic oppression. They developed new forms of architecture specifically designed to create psychological pressure, new administrative techniques for managing terror campaigns across multiple regions simultaneously, new communication systems for coordinating complex operations involving psychological manipulation and social destruction. The technological knowledge developed through these efforts had applications far beyond the immediate purposes for which it was created. The administrative techniques developed for managing terror campaigns proved useful for other forms of large-scale social control. The psychological insights gained through systematic torture informed approaches to education, religion, and economic management. The diplomatic implications were perhaps most far-reaching of all. The Viking innovations had transformed international relations by introducing techniques that made traditional forms of negotiation and alliance building obsolete. Later rulers refined these diplomatic approaches, creating new forms of international relations based entirely on the systematic manipulation of fear. What emerged was a form of diplomacy that was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. Traditional medieval diplomacy was based on concepts of mutual respect, shared interests, and reciprocal obligations. The new diplomatic approaches were based purely on the ability to inflict suffering, on the threat of systematic terror, rather than the promise of mutual benefit. This diplomatic revolution had profound implications for the development of medieval European politics. Traditional forms of international cooperation became increasingly difficult as rulers adopted techniques that made trust and mutual respect psychologically impossible. The international system became based on fear rather than mutual interest, creating cycles of escalating terror that consumed entire regions. The legal implications were equally significant. The Viking innovations had challenged traditional concepts of justice and proportional punishment by proving that unlimited cruelty could be politically effective. Later rulers refined these legal approaches, creating new frameworks of jurisprudence based entirely on the systematic application of terror. What emerged were legal systems that bore no resemblance to traditional concepts of justice. Laws were designed not to maintain social order or protect the innocent, but to maximize the ruler's ability to inflict psychological pressure on the population. Courts became venues for elaborate displays of cruelty rather than institutions for determining guilt or innocence. These legal innovations had lasting influence on the development of European jurisprudence. The understanding that law could be used as a tool of systematic oppression rather than social protection became part of the knowledge available to future rulers. The techniques developed for using legal systems to inflict psychological pressure remained part of the toolkit of authoritarian governance for centuries to come. The educational implications were particularly long-lasting. The Viking innovations had proven that entire populations could be systematically prevented from developing the psychological resources necessary for resistance. Later rulers refined these educational approaches, creating comprehensive systems for ensuring that future generations would be incapable of challenging their authority. What emerged were educational systems designed not to develop human potential, but to systematically limit it. Students were taught not to think critically or develop independent judgment, but to accept suffering as inevitable and resistance as impossible. The intellectual traditions that had previously allowed communities to develop effective responses to oppression were systematically eliminated. These educational innovations had profound implications for the development of medieval European culture. Entire regions lost access to the intellectual traditions that had previously allowed them to maintain their independence and cultural identity. The knowledge necessary for effective resistance was systematically eliminated, leaving populations defenseless against future oppression. The medical implications were equally disturbing. The Viking innovations had required sophisticated understanding of human physiology and psychology, knowledge of how to inflict maximum suffering while keeping victims alive and conscious. Later, rulers refined these medical approaches, creating what were essentially perverted forms of healthcare designed to maximize rather than minimize human suffering. What emerged were medical traditions that used healing knowledge to inflict harm, that applied sophisticated understanding of human biology to create new forms of torture and psychological pressure. Physicians became specialists in prolonging suffering rather than alleviating it. Medical institutions became centers for developing new techniques of systematic cruelty. The knowledge developed through these perverted medical traditions had influence far beyond its immediate applications. The understanding of human psychology and physiology gained through systematic torture informed other aspects of medieval medicine and natural philosophy. The boundary between healing and harming became increasingly blurred as medical knowledge was systematically weaponized. The architectural implications were particularly visible and long-lasting. The Viking innovations had required new approaches to building design, structures specifically created to maximize psychological impact and facilitate systematic terror. Later rulers refined these architectural approaches, creating increasingly sophisticated built environments designed to break human resistance. What emerged were entire cities designed around the systematic infliction of psychological pressure. Buildings were constructed not for human comfort or practical function, but to create constant reminders of the ruler's power and the population's vulnerability. Public spaces became venues for elaborate displays of cruelty. Private spaces were designed to prevent the development of trust or cooperation. These architectural innovations had lasting influence on medieval European urban development. Even cities that had never directly experienced these rulers' techniques were influenced by architectural approaches that normalized surveillance, intimidation, and psychological pressure. The built environment itself became a tool of systematic oppression. The agricultural implications were equally significant. The Viking innovations had proven that populations could be systematically prevented from developing the resources necessary for independence or resistance. Later, rulers refined these agricultural approaches, creating systems of food production and distribution designed to maintain maximum vulnerability and dependence. What emerged were agricultural systems designed not to maximize productivity or ensure food security, but to create constant pressure and uncertainty. Food became a tool of psychological manipulation rather than a basic human need to be satisfied. Populations were kept in states of chronic malnutrition and food insecurity that made organized resistance psychologically impossible. These agricultural innovations had profound implications for medieval European economic development. Entire regions became trapped in cycles of dependency and vulnerability that made independent development impossible. The techniques developed for using food as a tool of psychological control remained part of the toolkit of authoritarian governance for centuries to come. The transportation implications were perhaps most subtle but equally important. The Viking innovations had required sophisticated systems for moving people, resources, and information across large distances while maintaining psychological pressure on subject populations. Later rulers refined these transportation approaches, creating infrastructure designed to facilitate oppression rather than economic development. What emerged were transportation systems designed not to connect communities or facilitate trade, but to ensure that no population could develop the independence necessary for effective resistance. Roads, bridges, and communication networks were constructed to serve the needs of systematic terror rather than economic or social development. These transportation innovations had lasting influence on medieval European infrastructure development. The understanding that transportation systems could be designed to facilitate oppression rather than development became part of the knowledge available to future rulers. Infrastructure became a tool of systematic control rather than economic growth. The cumulative effect of all these innovations was the creation of a form of civilization that was genuinely unprecedented in human history. What had started as Viking techniques for maximizing the effectiveness of raids and conquests had evolved into comprehensive systems for the systematic destruction of human potential and the permanent prevention of resistance or independence. The rulers who inherited and refined these techniques had created something that went far beyond traditional tyranny or authoritarianism. They had developed methods for attacking the fundamental psychological and social foundations that made human civilization possible, techniques for ensuring that their subjects would be permanently incapable of developing the resources necessary for effective resistance. The long-term historical impact of these innovations extended far beyond the medieval period. The techniques developed during this era established precedents and created knowledge that would continue to influence authoritarian rulers throughout subsequent centuries of human history. The understanding that human societies could be systematically destroyed from within, that populations could be made permanently incapable of resistance, became part of the dark inheritance that medieval Europe bequeathed to the modern world. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that these techniques continued to evolve and spread long after the original Viking pioneers had disappeared from history. The innovations they had created took on lives of their own, continuing to develop and refine themselves as they spread from ruler to ruler, generation to generation, creating an ever-expanding toolkit of systematic oppression that would plague human civilization for centuries to come. The question that remained was whether human societies would eventually develop effective defenses against these techniques, whether the knowledge of how to destroy civilization would eventually be balanced by knowledge of how to protect it. The evidence from the medieval period suggests that this balance was never achieved, that the innovations in systematic cruelty continued to outpace any corresponding developments in resistance or protection. The legacy of these Viking pioneers in systematic terror thus represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, a period when the techniques for destroying human potential were refined to a degree that had never been achieved before and would continue to influence the development of authoritarian power for centuries to come. Their innovations established the foundation for forms of oppression that would continue to plague human civilization long after the Viking Age itself had become nothing more than a distant memory. The systematic destruction perfected by these Viking masters created ripple effects that transformed medieval warfare itself into something unrecognizable. Traditional battles between armies became almost obsolete as rulers realized that psychological warfare could achieve far greater results with minimal resources. Why risk losing warriors in combat when you could simply break your enemy's will to fight before the battle even began? This shift fundamentally altered the nature of medieval military training. Where previous generations of warriors had focused on developing skill with weapons and tactics for battlefield combat, the new breed of Viking-influenced fighters specialized in psychological manipulation and terror tactics. They learned to read human nature like a map, identifying the specific fears and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in different types of opponents. The training camps established by these later rulers became laboratories for developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to breaking human resistance. Young warriors weren't just taught how to kill efficiently, they were educated in the subtle arts of psychological pressure, the precise application of fear, and the systematic destruction of enemy morale. These weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were specialists in human destruction. What made these training programs particularly effective was their systematic approach to understanding different types of human psychology. Instructors developed detailed classifications of personality types, each with corresponding techniques for maximum psychological impact. A proud warrior required different treatment than a devoted parent. A religious leader needed different pressure than a wealthy merchant. This psychological sophistication allowed Viking-influenced forces to achieve unprecedented efficiency in their campaigns. Rather than applying the same brutal techniques to everyone, they could customize their approach based on detailed psychological profiles of their targets. The result was terror campaigns that were far more effective than anything previous generations had achieved. The economic model that supported these innovations was equally revolutionary. Traditional Viking raids had been essentially smash-and-grab operations, quick strikes designed to seize portable wealth before defenders could organize effective resistance. The new approach required substantial upfront investment in intelligence gathering, psychological analysis, and specialized training, but the long-term returns were exponentially greater. Communities that had been subjected to these refined techniques didn't just pay tribute once and then rebuild their defenses. They became permanent sources of revenue, populations so thoroughly broken that they would continue generating wealth for their oppressors indefinitely. The initial investment in systematic terror paid dividends for decades or even generations. This economic efficiency attracted imitators throughout medieval Europe. Rulers who had previously relied on traditional taxation or military conquest began adopting Viking-inspired techniques because they proved far more profitable in the long run. The knowledge of how to systematically break human resistance became one of the most valuable commodities in medieval politics. The technological innovations required to support these operations were equally sophisticated. The Vikings had pioneered new approaches to intelligence gathering, developing networks of agents who could infiltrate target communities months or years before any military action began. These agents weren't traditional spies focused on military information. They were psychological specialists trained to map the emotional and social vulnerabilities of entire populations. The information gathering techniques they developed were remarkably comprehensive. Agents would spend months learning about family relationships, religious beliefs, economic dependencies, and social hierarchies within target communities. They would identify key individuals whose corruption or destruction would have maximum psychological impact on the broader population. This intelligence was then used to design terror campaigns that were precisely calibrated to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of each target community. Rather than applying generic techniques, these later Viking-influenced rulers could create customized approaches that would be devastatingly effective against particular populations while requiring minimal resources to implement. The communication systems developed to coordinate these complex operations were equally advanced. Traditional Viking raids had been relatively simple affairs that could be coordinated through basic signals and predetermined plans. The new psychological warfare campaigns required constant communication between multiple agents operating across different regions over extended periods. The solutions they developed involved sophisticated networks of messengers, coded communication systems, and coordination protocols that allowed complex operations to be managed across vast distances. These communication innovations had applications far beyond military campaigns, influencing the development of medieval administrative systems and commercial networks. The religious implications of these innovations continue to evolve in disturbing directions. While the original Viking pioneers had at least maintained some connection to traditional Norse religious practices, their successors increasingly developed entirely new theological frameworks designed to justify their systematic cruelty. These new religious interpretations weren't simply corruptions of existing faiths. They were comprehensive alternative theologies that portrayed the systematic destruction of human hope as a form of sacred work. Practitioners developed elaborate rituals around the infliction of suffering, complex mythologies that celebrated terror as divine service, and sophisticated theological arguments for why breaking human spirits was actually beneficial to their victims. What made these religious innovations particularly dangerous was how they spread beyond the immediate circles of Viking-influenced rulers. The theological frameworks they developed began influencing mainstream religious thought throughout medieval Europe, creating new traditions of sanctified cruelty that would persist long after their original creators had disappeared. The educational systems that emerged to transmit this knowledge represented perhaps the most disturbing development of all. These weren't simply training programs for individual rulers or warriors. They were comprehensive educational institutions designed to create entire generations of leaders who viewed systematic terror as normal and necessary. Students in these programs were exposed to detailed case studies of successful terror campaigns, theoretical frameworks for understanding human psychological vulnerabilities, and practical training in the application of pressure techniques. They learned to think systematically about human destruction, to approach the breaking of communities and individuals as technical problems requiring sophisticated solutions. The graduates of these programs carried their knowledge throughout medieval Europe, establishing similar institutions in their own territories and training new generations of specialists in systematic oppression. The knowledge base that had originated with Viking innovations became a self-perpetuating educational tradition that continued to grow and evolve over time. The cultural impact of this educational expansion was profound. Entire regions of medieval Europe began developing cultures that normalized extreme cruelty, that viewed the systematic destruction of human potential as sophisticated rather than barbaric. Art, literature, music, and philosophy all began reflecting these values, creating cultural environments that celebrated, rather than condemned, systematic terror. The legal frameworks that developed to support these operations were equally comprehensive. Traditional medieval law had been based on concepts of justice, proportional punishment, and the protection of legitimate interests. The new legal systems were designed purely to facilitate the systematic application of psychological pressure and the elimination of any potential sources of resistance. These legal innovations went far beyond simply making terror tactics legal. They created comprehensive frameworks for identifying potential sources of resistance before they could develop, for justifying preemptive action against anyone who might eventually pose a threat, and for ensuring that legal systems themselves became tools of psychological manipulation rather than institutions for protecting rights or maintaining justice. The administrative systems required to manage these complex operations represented another major innovation. Traditional Viking raids had required minimal administration beyond basic coordination of warriors and distribution of loot. The new psychological warfare campaigns required sophisticated bureaucracies capable of managing intelligence networks, coordinating complex operations across multiple regions, and maintaining long-term pressure on numerous target populations simultaneously. The administrative techniques developed to meet these needs influenced the evolution of medieval governmental systems throughout Europe. Concepts of systematic surveillance, preemptive intervention, and comprehensive social control that had originated in Viking terror campaigns became standard features of medieval statecraft. The medical knowledge that supported these operations continued to evolve in increasingly disturbing directions. The original Viking innovations had required basic understanding of human physiology and psychology to maximize the effectiveness of torture and terror. Later practitioners developed this knowledge into sophisticated medical traditions, focused on the systematic manipulation of human suffering. These medical innovations went far beyond simple torture techniques. Practitioners developed comprehensive understanding of how to manipulate human psychological states through carefully controlled physical interventions, how to create specific emotional responses through targeted medical procedures, and how to use healing knowledge to inflict precisely calibrated forms of harm. The knowledge developed through these perverted medical traditions had profound influence on the development of medieval medicine as a whole. The boundary between healing and harming became increasingly blurred as medical practitioners incorporated techniques originally developed for torture into their standard approaches to treating patients. The architectural innovations continued to evolve as well, creating built environments that were specifically designed to facilitate systematic psychological manipulation. These weren't simply defensive structures or administrative buildings. They were comprehensive environmental systems designed to create constant psychological pressure on anyone who entered them. The architectural principles developed through these projects influenced medieval building practices throughout Europe. Concepts of surveillance architecture, intimidation through design, and the use of physical space to create psychological pressure became standard features of medieval construction. The agricultural systems that supported these operations were equally sophisticated. Traditional Viking raids had relied on quick seizure of existing food supplies, but the new long-term terror campaigns required sustainable systems for maintaining large populations in states of controlled vulnerability and dependence. The agricultural innovations developed to meet these needs went far beyond simple resource extraction. Practitioners learned to use food distribution as a tool of psychological manipulation, to create artificial scarcities that would increase psychological pressure, and to design agricultural systems that would prevent target populations from developing the independence necessary for effective resistance. The transportation networks that facilitated these operations represented another major innovation. The coordination of complex psychological warfare campaigns across multiple regions required sophisticated systems for moving people, resources, and information while maintaining security and psychological pressure on subject populations. The transportation innovations developed for these purposes influenced the development of medieval infrastructure throughout Europe. Road systems, communication networks, and logistics chains were increasingly designed to facilitate governmental control rather than economic development or social connection. The cumulative effect of all these innovations was the creation of comprehensive systems for the systematic management of human suffering. What had begun as Viking techniques for maximizing the effectiveness of raids had evolved into integrated approaches to social control that could maintain entire populations in states of permanent psychological subjugation. The rulers who perfected these systems had created something that went far beyond traditional concepts of tyranny or oppression. They had developed methods for attacking the fundamental psychological foundations that made human resistance possible, ensuring that their subjects would remain permanently incapable of developing the resources necessary for independence or rebellion. The knowledge they created became a permanent part of the toolkit available to authoritarian rulers throughout subsequent history. The techniques for systematic psychological destruction, the methods for breaking human communities from within, the approaches to preventing the development of resistance before it could become effective. All of this became part of the dark inheritance that medieval Europe passed on to future generations. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that these techniques continued to evolve and spread long after their original creators had disappeared. The systematic approaches to human destruction took on lives of their own, continuing to develop and refine themselves as they passed from ruler to ruler, creating an ever-expanding arsenal of oppression that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The question that haunted medieval observers was whether any effective defense could ever be developed against these techniques. The systematic destruction of human psychological resources seemed to create permanent damage that could not be reversed through traditional means. Communities that had been subjected to these methods appeared to lose the capacity for recovery, remaining broken and vulnerable to future oppression indefinitely. The long-term historical implications of these innovations extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The knowledge of how to systematically destroy human potential, how to break the psychological foundations of resistance, how to create permanent vulnerability in human populations, became part of the permanent knowledge base available to future authoritarian rulers throughout history. The techniques pioneered by these Viking masters and refined by their successors established precedents that would continue to influence the development of oppressive governmental systems for centuries to come. Their innovations created a dark legacy that would plague human civilization long after the original practitioners had been forgotten. A legacy of systematic cruelty that would continue to find new applications and new practitioners throughout the subsequent course of human history. The transformation of Viking culture from a society of warriors into a civilization of systematic psychological destroyers thus represents one of the most significant and disturbing developments in medieval European history. It marked the evolution of human cruelty from a tool of immediate conquest into a science of permanent social control, establishing techniques and precedents that would continue to influence authoritarian governance for centuries to come. The rulers we have examined represent the culmination of this evolution. Individuals who pushed the boundaries of systematic oppression so far beyond anything previously imagined that they created entirely new categories of human evil. Their innovations established the foundation for forms of governmental control that would continue to plague human societies long after the Viking Age itself had passed into history. Understanding these historical developments is crucial not just for comprehending the medieval past, but for recognizing the patterns and techniques that continue to influence authoritarian systems in our own time. The knowledge of how to systematically destroy human potential, how to break the psychological foundations of resistance, remains part of the toolkit available to those who seek absolute power over other human beings. The legacy of these Viking innovations in systematic terror thus represents one of the darkest chapters in the development of human political systems, a period when techniques for destroying human freedom and dignity were refined to a degree that had never been achieved before and would continue to influence the evolution of oppressive governance throughout subsequent history. The most chilling aspect of this systematic evolution was how it transformed the very concept of leadership itself throughout medieval Europe. Traditional rulers had been expected to protect their subjects, to provide security and prosperity in exchange for loyalty and service. The Viking-influenced kings created an entirely different model of leadership, one based on the systematic cultivation of helplessness and despair in their own populations. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several generations, as each successive ruler built upon the innovations of his predecessors, while adding his own refinements to the art of systematic oppression. What emerged was a form of governance that was designed not to serve the needs of the population, but to ensure their permanent subjugation through carefully calibrated psychological pressure. The techniques these rulers developed for maintaining control were remarkably sophisticated. They understood that traditional forms of oppression, based on physical force and the threat of violence, were ultimately unstable because they created resentment and desire for revenge. Their innovations focused instead on breaking the psychological mechanisms that made resistance possible in the first place. One of their most effective strategies was the systematic destruction of social trust within communities. They developed elaborate techniques for turning neighbors against each other, for creating suspicion and paranoia that made cooperation impossible. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious behavior, to compete for favor by betraying others, to view anyone who wasn't actively collaborating with the authorities as a potential threat. This destruction of social trust had devastating long-term consequences. Communities that had previously been able to organize effective resistance found themselves paralyzed by internal suspicion and fear. People became afraid to speak openly, afraid to form relationships, afraid to take any action that might be interpreted as opposition to the ruling regime. The rulers refined these techniques by studying the specific social structures of different communities and developing targeted approaches for destroying them. A community based on extended family networks would be attacked differently than one organized around religious institutions or trade associations. Each social structure had its own vulnerabilities, and these Viking-influenced kings became experts at identifying and exploiting them. What made their approach particularly insidious was how they used people's natural desire for security and stability against them. They would create artificial crises, manufactured threats that made their oppressive measures seem necessary for survival. People would voluntarily surrender freedoms and accept restrictions because they believed these sacrifices were temporary measures needed to address immediate dangers. The artificial crises these rulers created were often remarkably sophisticated. They might orchestrate attacks by supposed external enemies, spread rumors of internal conspiracies, or create economic disruptions that seemed to require emergency governmental intervention. The population would beg for protection, never realizing that the threats they feared had been deliberately created by their own leaders. This technique proved so effective that it became a standard tool of authoritarian governance throughout medieval Europe. Rulers learned that people would accept almost any level of oppression if they could be convinced it was necessary for their own protection. The systematic creation of fear became more valuable than any army or treasury. The educational systems these rulers established were designed to ensure that future generations would be psychologically incapable of recognizing or resisting these manipulation techniques. Children were taught from an early age that questioning authority was dangerous, that independent thinking led to chaos and suffering, that their safety depended entirely on absolute obedience to their leaders. These educational programs went far beyond simple indoctrination. They were comprehensive systems for reshaping human psychology, for creating individuals who would be fundamentally incapable of the independent judgment necessary for effective resistance. Students learned to distrust their own perceptions, to defer to authority, even when that authority was clearly harmful, to view submission as virtue and resistance as sin. The long-term effects of these educational innovations were catastrophic. Entire regions of Europe developed populations that were psychologically incapable of self-governance. communities that would collapse into chaos whenever their oppressive leaders were removed, because they had never learned the skills necessary for independent decision-making or cooperative problem-solving. The economic systems that supported these operations were equally sophisticated. Traditional medieval economies had been based on the production and exchange of goods and services that met genuine human needs. The Viking-influenced rulers created economic systems designed to maximize dependency while generating resources for maintaining their apparatus of oppression. These economic innovations involved the systematic destruction of local self-sufficiency. Communities that had previously been able to meet their own basic needs were forced into dependency relationships that made resistance economically impossible. Essential resources were controlled by the ruling regime, distributed in ways that rewarded compliance and punished any sign of independence. The rulers developed elaborate systems for monitoring and controlling economic activity at every level. They established networks of informants who reported on trade relationships, production levels, and resource distribution. Any sign of economic independence or unauthorized cooperation was immediately suppressed through targeted economic pressure or outright confiscation. What made these economic control systems particularly effective was how they exploited people's natural desire to provide for their families. Parents would accept any level of personal degradation if it meant their children would have food and shelter. The rulers learned to use these parental instincts as tools of control, creating situations where resistance would directly harm the people resistors most wanted to protect. The technological innovations required to maintain these systems of control continued to evolve throughout the medieval period. The original Viking techniques had been relatively simple, relying primarily on intimidation and the threat of violence. Their successors developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to surveillance, information gathering, and population management. These technological developments included new forms of architecture designed to facilitate constant observation, communication systems that allowed rapid coordination of suppression efforts across large territories, and administrative techniques for managing complex networks of informants and enforcers. The infrastructure of oppression became increasingly sophisticated and efficient over time. The religious frameworks that justified these systems also continued to evolve. While the original Viking rulers had at least maintained some connection to traditional religious practices, their successors developed entirely new theological systems that portrayed systematic oppression as a form of divine service. These religious innovations weren't simply corruptions of existing faiths, they were comprehensive alternative spiritualities that celebrated the destruction of human independence as a sacred duty. Practitioners developed elaborate rituals around the suppression of resistance, complex mythologies that portrayed freedom as a form of spiritual corruption, and sophisticated theological arguments for why absolute submission was necessary for salvation. The cultural impact of these religious innovations was profound. They created environments where questioning authority wasn't just politically dangerous, it was spiritually condemned. People learned to view their own desires for freedom and dignity as sinful impulses that needed to be suppressed for the good of their souls. These religious frameworks proved remarkably durable because they addressed genuine human spiritual needs, while channeling them in directions that supported authoritarian control. People who might have resisted purely secular oppression found themselves unable to oppose systems that claimed divine sanction and offered spiritual rewards for compliance. The legal systems that developed to support these operations represented another major innovation in systematic oppression. Traditional medieval law had been based on concepts of justice and proportional punishment. The new legal frameworks were designed purely to facilitate the identification and suppression of potential resistance before it could develop into actual threats. These legal innovations created comprehensive systems for criminalizing not just actions, but thoughts and intentions that might eventually lead to resistance. People could be punished not for what they had done, but for what authorities believed they might eventually do. The legal system became a tool for preemptive suppression rather than reactive justice. The The judicial procedures that implemented these legal frameworks were designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal process. Trials became elaborate psychological operations designed to break defendants mentally, while demonstrating to observers the futility of resistance. The medical knowledge that supported these systems continued to develop in increasingly disturbing directions. The original Viking innovations had required basic understanding of human psychology to maximize the effectiveness of intimidation and torture. Later practitioners developed this knowledge into comprehensive medical traditions focused on the systematic manipulation of human mental states. These medical innovations went far beyond simple torture techniques. Practitioners developed sophisticated understanding of how to create specific psychological conditions through carefully controlled interventions, how to maintain populations in states of chronic stress and anxiety, and how to use medical authority to justify and implement oppressive measures. The knowledge developed through these perverted medical traditions had profound influence on medieval healthcare as a whole. The boundary between healing and control became increasingly blurred as medical practitioners incorporated techniques originally developed for population management into their standard approaches to treating patients. The architectural innovations that supported these systems created built environments specifically designed to reinforce psychological submission. These weren't simply defensive structures. They were comprehensive environmental systems designed to create constant reminders of authority and the futility of resistance. The architectural principles developed through these projects influenced building practices throughout medieval Europe. Public spaces were designed to facilitate surveillance and crowd control. Private buildings incorporated features that prevented unauthorized gatherings, and entire urban layouts were planned to maximize governmental control while minimizing opportunities for organized resistance. The transportation networks that facilitated these operations were equally sophisticated. The coordination of complex population control systems across multiple regions required advanced infrastructure for moving personnel, resources, and information while maintaining security and preventing the development of unauthorized communication networks. The transportation innovations developed for these purposes had lasting influence on medieval infrastructure development. Road systems, communication networks, and logistics chains were increasingly designed to serve governmental control rather than economic development or social connection. The agricultural systems that sustained these operations were designed to maintain populations in states of controlled vulnerability. Rather than maximizing food production or ensuring food security, these systems were calibrated to create just enough scarcity to maintain dependency while preventing the desperation that might lead to desperate resistance. The agricultural innovations developed for these purposes went far beyond simple resource control. Practitioners learned to use food distribution as a tool of psychological manipulation, to create artificial fluctuations in availability that would increase anxiety and compliance, and to design agricultural systems that would prevent communities from developing the independence necessary for effective resistance. The cumulative effect of all these innovations was the creation of integrated systems for the comprehensive management of human populations. What had begun as Viking techniques for maximizing the effectiveness of military campaigns had evolved into sophisticated approaches to social control that could maintain entire civilizations in states of permanent psychological subjugation. The rulers who perfected these systems had created something that represented a fundamental departure from previous forms of human governance. They had developed methods for attacking the psychological and social foundations that made human freedom possible, ensuring that their subjects would remain permanently incapable of developing the resources necessary for independence or self-determination. The knowledge they created became a permanent part of the toolkit available to authoritarian rulers throughout subsequent history. The techniques for systematic psychological control, the methods for breaking human communities from within, the approaches to preventing the development of resistance before it could become effective. All of this became part of the dark inheritance that medieval Europe passed on to future generations. The long-term historical implications of these innovations extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The understanding of how to systematically destroy human independence, how to break the psychological foundations of resistance, how to create permanent dependency in human populations, became part of the permanent knowledge base available to oppressive governmental systems throughout history. The techniques pioneered by these Viking-influenced rulers established precedents that would continue to influence the development of authoritarian governance for centuries to come. Their innovations created a legacy of systematic oppression that would find new applications and new practitioners throughout the subsequent course of human civilization. The transformation we have examined thus represents one of the most significant and disturbing developments in the history of human political systems. It marked the evolution of governmental authority from a tool for organizing cooperative human activity into a science of systematic human subjugation, establishing techniques and precedents that would continue to threaten human freedom and dignity throughout subsequent history. Understanding these historical developments remains crucial for recognizing and resisting similar patterns in our own time. The knowledge of how to systematically destroy human independence and dignity continues to exist, and the techniques developed by these medieval innovators in oppression continue to influence authoritarian systems throughout the world. The legacy of these Viking innovations in systematic control thus represents one of the most important cautionary tales in human history, a reminder of how quickly and completely human freedom can be destroyed when sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation are combined with absolute political power and the systematic elimination of all institutional checks on governmental authority. The most chilling realization about these Viking innovators in systematic terror is that their techniques didn't disappear with the end of the Viking Age. Instead, they became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated systems of control that would plague human civilization for centuries to come. The knowledge they had created about breaking human resistance, destroying social bonds, and eliminating the psychological foundations of freedom became a permanent part of the dark toolkit available to authoritarian rulers throughout history. What makes their legacy particularly disturbing is how their innovations continue to evolve long after their original creators had died. Each generation of rulers who inherited these techniques found ways to refine them further, to make them more efficient, more comprehensive, and more difficult to resist. The systematic destruction of human dignity became an art form that was constantly being perfected by new practitioners. The ripple effects of their work spread far beyond medieval Europe. As trade routes expanded and political knowledge traveled across continents, the techniques pioneered by these Viking masters found their way into entirely different cultures and civilizations. Rulers who had never heard of Ivar the Boneless or the unnamed king nevertheless began implementing remarkably similar approaches to population control and psychological manipulation. This global spread of systematic oppression techniques created a dark, convergent evolution in human governance. Civilizations that had developed independently for thousands of years suddenly began adopting similar methods for breaking human resistance, suggesting that these Viking innovations had tapped into something fundamental about the relationship between power and human psychology. The most terrifying aspect of this legacy is how it normalized extreme cruelty as a standard tool of governance. Practices that would have been considered unthinkably barbaric by earlier generations became routine administrative procedures. The systematic destruction of human hope and dignity was transformed from an aberration into a professional skill that rulers were expected to master. Modern historians studying this dark evolution often struggle with the implications of what they discover. The techniques developed by these Viking pioneers were so effective, so comprehensive in their destruction of human agency, that they challenge our fundamental assumptions about human resilience and the sustainability of free societies. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new horrors as excavation techniques improve and previously inaccessible sites are explored. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of how completely these rulers had transformed the nature of power itself, how thoroughly they had weaponized human psychology against the populations they controlled. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the recognition that the knowledge they created hasn't disappeared. The understanding of how to systematically break human resistance, how to destroy the social foundations that make freedom possible, how to create permanent psychological dependency, remains part of the available toolkit for anyone who seeks absolute power over other human beings. The Viking kings and warlords we have examined represent more than just historical curiosities or examples of medieval brutality. They were pioneers in the systematic destruction of human dignity, innovators who pushed the boundaries of cruelty so far beyond anything previously imagined that they created entirely new categories of evil that continue to influence our world today. Their legacy serves as a permanent warning about what humans are capable of becoming when power is combined with unlimited cruelty and sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They prove that there are no natural limits to how completely human societies can be destroyed, no inherent boundaries that will prevent the systematic elimination of freedom and dignity when those in power are determined to achieve absolute control. The techniques they developed for breaking human resistance, corrupting moral judgment, and destroying the psychological foundations of independence remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The knowledge of how to systematically destroy human potential continues to exist, waiting to be rediscovered and refined by future generations of authoritarian rulers. Understanding this dark history is crucial not just for comprehending the medieval past, but for recognizing and resisting similar patterns in our own time. The warning these Viking innovators provide about the fragility of human freedom and the permanence of techniques for destroying it remains one of the most important lessons we can learn from the study of history. Their story reminds us that civilization itself is far more fragile than we often assume, that the psychological and social foundations that make human freedom possible can be systematically destroyed by those who understand how to exploit our deepest vulnerabilities. The Vikings, who earned the title of most terrible rulers in history, did so not just through individual acts of cruelty, but by creating comprehensive systems for the permanent elimination of human dignity and independence. The legacy they left behind continues to cast its shadow over human civilization, a permanent reminder of how quickly and completely everything we value about human society can be destroyed when sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation are combined with absolute power and the systematic elimination of all constraints on governmental authority. Their innovations in systematic terror thus represent one of the darkest chapters in human history, a period when the techniques for destroying human freedom and dignity were refined to a degree that had never been achieved before and would continue to threaten human civilization for centuries to come. The most terrible Viking kings and warlords earned their place in history not just through their individual cruelty, but by creating a legacy of systematic oppression that would plague humanity long after their names had been forgotten.